James. I stood at the dresser in our bedroom, my fingers sliding over the smooth wood as I rummaged through the top drawer. The car keys, the spare ones that always got lost, were in there somewhere, I was sure. Ashley always laughed at me when I turned the house upside down looking for the damn keys. James, you're like a child, honestly, she'd say, shaking her head, her dark hair falling around her shoulders, framing a face I knew better than my own. 18 years together wasn't just a time, it was a lifetime, woven together out of little things. The morning coffee she always made a little stronger than I liked, her habit of falling asleep with a book on her chest, my grumbling about the endless jars of cream on the bathroom shelf. It was our life. I thought I knew it inside out. But the moment my fingers found the thick envelope tucked under a pile of neatly folded socks, I felt something inside me shift. This wasn't just a letter. It was an object that shouldn't have been there. It was white, slightly yellowed around the edges, as if it had been handled too many times before being tucked away. On the front was my name, written in her handwriting. Ashley always wrote with a slight tilt to the right, the letters soft and rounded, as if she were putting a little of her own warmth into them. For Jimmy, if you ever know. Jimmy. She only called me that in the most tender moments or the hardest. I froze. The room was silent, except for the ticking of a wall clock somewhere in the distance, counting down the seconds that I would later understand divided my life into before and after. I stared at the envelope, questions swarming in my head. Why was it here? Why was it hidden? What did she want me to know? My fingers trembled as I tore the paper. I didn't think, didn't analyze, I simply acted, as if some invisible force were pushing me forward. Inside was a piece of paper, folded in half, covered in her neat handwriting. I unfolded it, and from the first lines, the world around me began to crumble. James, the letter began, if you're reading this, then you already know. Or suspect. I didn't want you to find out this way, but I guess it's inevitable. I don't know how to start. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman to write a letter like this. But I have to be honest, at least on paper, since I couldn't tell you to your face. I've been cheating on you for the last 6 months. His name is Thomas. He's my trainer at the gym. It wasn't planned, James. It just happened. I read the lines 3 times, trying to make the words sound different, trying to find some other meaning in them. But they were like a knife, stabbing deeper with each reading. Thomas, coach, 6 months. I felt the blood rush to my temples, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the ticking of the clock. I sank to the edge of the bed, still clutching the letter, and forced myself to read on. I know it sounds cliché, she went on, but I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't looking for him. It was just that for a moment I felt invisible. Not by you, James, you've always been good to me. But time, age, routine, they seemed to erase me. I'd look in the mirror and not see myself. And Thomas, he made me feel alive. He looked at me like I was still the girl I'd been before we got married, before the years had started to take their toll. That's no excuse, I know. But I want you to understand. I love you, James. I've always loved you. That hasn't changed. I just wanted to feel alive. I stopped. The piece of paper was shaking in my hands, and I realized it wasn't the paper shaking, it was me. My fingers, my shoulders, my whole body vibrated with emotions I couldn't name or control. Shock. Yes, it was a shock. But underneath it, like dark water under thin ice, something else was rising: pain, anger, betrayal. I tried to imagine her with him. With this Thomas. The way she laughed, the way her eyes lit up, the way she adjusted her hair when she was nervous, everything I thought was mine, ours. And now it was his. I closed my eyes, trying to push the images away, but they crept into my head, vivid, painful, like stills from someone else's film. I stood up and paced the room. The bedroom, our bedroom, suddenly seemed foreign to me. The bed we had shared for so many years, covered in her favorite blue bedspread. The photograph on the nightstand of us on the beach 10 years ago, her arm around my waist, me laughing because she had just splashed me with water. The mirror in which she had seen not herself, but some other woman, aging, invisible. All of it was now saturated with lies. I squeezed the letter in my fist, as if I could crush the very truth it carried. But the truth was there. It was there, in those words, in her handwriting, in her confession. 6 months. For 6 months, she had lived a double life, coming home, kissing me, cooking dinner, discussing weekend plans, and all the while. Thomas. I felt my throat tighten, as if someone had tightened a noose around it. It became harder to breathe. I sat back down on the bed and forced myself to read the letter again. Every word hit me like a blow. I didn't want you to know like this. Then what, Ashley? How did you want me to know? Did you even want me to know? Or were you going to carry this secret with you until it ate away at you? Maybe it hadn't eaten away at her. Maybe she was happy, alive like she'd written. That thought was the worst of all. What if she was happy with him? What if these 6 months had been better for her than all our years together? I stood up and walked to the window. It was a normal day outside. A neighbor was watering the lawn. A dog was barking somewhere. The sun was lazily setting, filling the street with a warm orange light. The world outside hadn't changed, but inside, everything was falling apart. I tried to remember the last 6 months. Were there any signs? Was she different? I replayed our evenings, our conversations in my head. She'd started going to the gym more often, that's for sure. She said she wanted to get in shape. I supported her. I was glad she was taking care of herself. What an idiot I had been. I remembered her coming home, flushed, with a smile that I took for enthusiasm for training. How she would sometimes be late, citing traffic or a meeting with a friend. One day, about 3 months ago, I noticed a slight mark on her neck, maybe a bruise, maybe a scratch. She said she had caught it on a machine. I believed her. I always believed her. Now those memories were like shards of glass, digging into my skin. I looked at the letter on the bed and knew I couldn't stay here. Not now. Not in this room, not in this house, where every single thing reminded me of her, of us, of what had turned out to be an illusion. I felt something breaking inside me, but I didn't want it to show. I didn't want to scream. I didn't want to break the dishes. I didn't want to make a scene. I just wanted to leave. I pulled out a duffel bag from the closet, the one we used to take on hikes when we were young and hopeful. I threw in a couple of shirts, some jeans, and a toothbrush. I moved mechanically, like a robot, not allowing myself to think. If I started thinking, I wouldn't be able to stop. And if I didn't stop, I'd start asking questions I didn't have answers to. Why, Ashley? What did I do wrong? When did you stop seeing me as the one you wanted? I zipped up my bag and stopped at the bedroom door. The letter was still on the bed, crumpled, but as real as the knife in my back. I didn't want to take it, but I couldn't leave it either. It was proof. Proof that my life as I knew it was over. I stuffed it into my jacket pocket, walked out of the bedroom, and closed the door behind me. In the living room, I paused to look at the house one last time. Everything here was soaked in us. The couch where we'd watched movies on Saturday nights. The kitchen table where we'd argued about where to go on vacation. The pictures on the walls, our wedding, our first home, our first vacation in Italy. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I clenched my jaw and forced myself to look away. Not now, not here. I left the house, got into my car, and just drove. Where? I didn't know. Maybe to my brother's in the next town over. Maybe to a motel on the outskirts. Maybe just down the highway until I ran out of gas. I turned on the radio, but the music was just annoying, so I turned it off and drove in silence. Just the sound of tires on asphalt and my own thoughts, which I tried to drown out. Ashley. Her face was in my mind. Her smile, her voice, her hands that I loved to hold. And now her words, written on paper, words that tore everything apart. I didn't know what I was going to do next. I didn't know if I'd ever go home. I didn't know if I'd ever be able to look at her again without seeing him. But I knew one thing. I couldn't stay. Not now. Maybe never. I drove, and the road stretched out before me, endless, like questions I didn't want to answer. The letter was in my pocket, heavy as a stone, and I knew it would follow me wherever I went. But I kept my foot on the gas because it was the only thing I could do. Drive away. Leave behind the house where it all began and where it all ended. I drove down the highway, the asphalt humming beneath my wheels like a low, monotonous chord that wouldn't let my thoughts fall silent. The landscape outside the window, endless fields punctuated by groves, and the occasional gas station was painfully familiar. This was Georgia, my Georgia, where every turn in the road seemed to mirror my life, predictable, measured, stable. But now that stability was crumbling like a sandcastle under a wave. Ashley's letter, crumpled in my jacket pocket, burned like a hot coal. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about her, about us. And the further I drove from home, the more I was drawn back not to the bedroom where I found that damned letter, but to those years when it all began, when I still believed I knew what love was. We met at the University of Georgia in Athens, back when I was en route cadet and she was an art major. I was 20, she was 19. I remember that day as if it were yesterday. It was October, and the air smelled of fallen leaves and smoke from the fires students were building on the outskirts of campus. I was walking across the square, my uniform pressed crisp, my backpack stuffed with engineering textbooks. Everything in my life was structured back then. My class schedule, my morning runs, my rock practices. I was a guy who lived by a rule, and I liked it. And then I saw her. Ashley was sitting on a bench under an old oak tree, an easel in front of her. Her jeans were stained with paint, blue and yellow spots like little explosions of color on the faded fabric. She was humming to herself as her brush glided across the canvas. I didn't know why, but I paused. Maybe it was her concentration, the way she furrowed her brow as she picked out the right shade, or the way the sunlight caught her dark hair, turning it a warm chestnut halo. I wasn't a romantic, but something in me twitched in that moment. I stepped closer and, unable to think of anything smarter to say, said, "Are you painting the tree you're sitting under?" She looked up, and I felt my cheeks heat up. It was a stupid question, but she didn't laugh. Instead, she smiled, not the polite smile strangers give each other, but a real, warm smile, as if we'd known each other for years. "No," she said, "I'm painting how this tree feels in the fall." I didn't understand what she meant, but her words stuck with me. They were so alive, unlike mine, which were always as clear as orders on the parade ground. That's how it all started. We started dating, casually at first coffee at a frat house, walks around campus, talking until midnight. She laughed at my straightforwardness, at the way I laid out everything. Plans for the day, for the week, for my life. "James, you're like a general planning an attack," she'd tease, and I'd grumble that without order the world would collapse. But her chaos, her spontaneity, her passion for painting, for life, they drew me in like a magnet. I'd watch her paint-stained hands transforming a blank canvas into something full of emotion, and I'd think, I wish I could do that. Not paint, but live with that same freedom, that same fire. I was an Air Force veteran by the time we married. I'd served 5 years after graduating, a flight engineer, always on call, always in control. Ashley waited for me, writing letters, long ones, full of stories about her paintings, about the students she taught at the local art school, about how much she missed me. I kept those letters, rereading them in the barracks, where everything was gray and the same. Her words were my anchor. We were married a year after I returned, in a small church on the outskirts of Savannah. She wore a simple white dress, daisies in her hair, and I wore a suit that she joked made me look like an overly serious groom. But I couldn't stop smiling that day. I looked at her and thought, this is forever. Samuel was born 2 years later. I remember holding him in the hospital, tiny, his tiny fingers wrapped around my pinky. Ashley was in the hospital bed, tired but happy, and I felt like my life had finally made sense. Not a career, not titles, not engineering drawings, but this, family. Molly came 3 years later, and our house in Savannah, old and with peeling paint on the porch, became a home. Loud and full of laughter, toys, Ashley's scattered pencils, my tools that I always forgot to put away. I opened a boat repair shop when I got back from the army. It was my thing to work with my hands, the smell of wood and varnish, the hum of the engines. I loved fixing things that were broken, bringing boats back to life so they could glide down the river again. It wasn't just a job, it was my sanctuary. It was where I could think, plan, control. Ashley taught school, teaching children to draw, and in the evenings she would tell me how her students were discovering art. She glowed when she talked about it, and I loved her for that her ability to see beauty in the little things, in a brush stroke, in a child's drawing. Our life was perfect. The neighbors said so. You and Ashley are like something out of an advert, Mrs. Clare, our next-door neighbor, said one day as we were having a barbecue in the backyard. I shrugged, but inside I was proud. We were the family I dreamed of. Me, a former Army officer, now a jack of all trades. Ashley, an artist with a soul full of light. Sam and Molly, our children, loud and curious and growing up too fast. On Sundays, we went to church, where Ashley sang in the choir, and even though I wasn't particularly religious, I found peace in those quiet mornings when we sat shoulder to shoulder, the children whispering in the back pew. But now, sitting in the car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, I asked myself, was this love? Or just a habit, a routine that I mistook for happiness? I remembered her laugh, her touch, her habit of falling asleep with her head on my shoulder. I remembered her dancing in the kitchen while she cooked dinner, singing 80s songs out of tune, but with such joy that I couldn't help but smile. I remembered us making plans, refinishing the porch, going to the lake, sending Sam to college. It was all real. Or was it? I tried to find the moment when everything changed, when she started feeling invisible, as she wrote. I didn't notice. I was too busy with the shop, the bills, and the kids. I thought I was doing everything right, providing for my family, fixing up the house, planning our future. But maybe that's not what she wanted. Maybe she wanted me to look at her the way that Guy, Thomas, did. To see not my wife, not the mother of my children, but her Ashley, the woman who once painted autumn trees and laughed at my bluntness. I stopped at a gas station, not because I was out of gas, but because I couldn't drive anymore. My head was spinning, my thoughts were racing. I got out of the car and breathed in the cool evening air. The sky over Savannah was clear and starry, and I suddenly remembered Ashley and I lying in the grass in our yard when Sam was a baby. She'd show me the constellations, and I'd pretend to understand what she was talking about when I was really just looking at her. I'd been sure then that we were forever, but now I know nothing. I pulled the letter out of my pocket and unfolded it. Her words, so familiar, so foreign, cut into my eyes. I just wanted to feel alive. The words echoed in my head, and I felt the anger I had tried to suppress rise up again. Alive? And what about me? Didn't I deserve the same? Hadn't I tried to make our life good? But the anger was quickly replaced by something else, emptiness. I didn't know what to do with this truth, this betrayal. I didn't know how to move on, knowing that the woman I loved, the woman I considered mine, had found something I couldn't give her. I got back in the car, but I didn't start the engine. Instead, I looked out the windshield at the stars and thought about how simple everything had been, back in college, when she was the girl with paint on her jeans, and I was the guy who believed that order would save the world. I thought about our children, Sam, who had inherited my love of precision, and Molly, who painted like her mother. I thought about our house, our studio, the life I'd built with such care. And I asked myself, if it was all a lie, if Ashley was unhappy, what was left? Was it love? Or just an illusion I'd created to protect myself from chaos? I didn't know the answer, but I knew I couldn't go home. Not today. Maybe never. I started the car and drove on, into the night, into the unknown, with the letter in my pocket and a heart that no longer knew what to believe. Works. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, looking at myself, trying to figure out who the woman was looking back at me. I was 40, and though I'd never considered myself old, that day I suddenly noticed the wrinkles at the corners of my eyes, the slightly sagging skin on my neck, the shadows of fatigue that seemed to have settled on my face forever. I wasn't unhappy, no. I had a family, a home, a job I loved, everything most people dream of. James, my husband, was as reliable as a rock. He always paid his bills on time, fixed everything that broke, held me in his arms in the evenings as we watched movies on the couch. Sam and Molly, our children, filled the house with laughter and chaos, and I loved being their mother. But that day, looking in the mirror, I realized that I didn't see myself. Not Ashley, who once painted until dawn, laughed at silly jokes, and danced to the radio in the kitchen. I saw my wife, my mother, my teacher. But where was I? That's when I decided to join a gym. It wasn't about becoming a cover model. I just wanted to get some energy back, to feel like my body was alive, not just a machine that cooked dinners, graded papers, and did laundry. There was a small gym in Savannah near the high school where I taught art called Iron Pulse, with bright signs and the smell of rubber and sweat. I chose it because it was close, and because they offered personal training. I needed help navigating the machines, which looked like they were straight out of a science fiction novel. My trainer was Thomas. He was 32, 8 years my junior, and looked like he'd stepped out of a Calvin Klein advert. He was tall, with broad shoulders, six-pack abs that showed through his tight t-shirt, and a smile that honestly took my breath away. I laughed at myself in those early days, a 40-year-old mother of two staring at her trainer like a schoolgirl. But Thomas wasn't just handsome. He was alive. He spoke with such energy, such enthusiasm, that I couldn't help but smile even as my muscles burned from the exercises and sweat ran down my face. At our first practice, he asked me why I was there. I shrugged and mumbled something about health and fitness. He nodded, but looked at me as if he saw more than I had said. "You want to feel strong," he said, and it wasn't a question, but a statement. I nodded because he was right. I wanted to be strong, not just physically. I wanted to feel like myself again. Working out became my sanctuary. 2, then 3 times a week, I'd show up to the gym, put on sneakers and leggings that at first seemed too tight, and give myself over to the process. Thomas was strict, but not like a school teacher, but like someone who truly believes in you. "Ashley, you can do more," he'd say when I was ready to give up on yet another set. "Look how much you've changed already." And I could see it. Not just in the mirror, though my waist was a little slimmer, my arms a little stronger. I could see it in my eyes, in the way I started holding my back straighter, in the way I smiled as I walked out of the gym, even though my legs were shaking from exhaustion. We started talking. At first, it was small stuff. He asked about my work, about what I drew, and I wanted to know how he became a coach. But gradually, the conversations deepened. I told him about my students, about the time one boy painted a series of paintings about space, and how that inspired me to pick up a paintbrush myself. He talked about his childhood in a small town in Alabama, about how sports saved him from trouble in his youth. He didn't talk about bills or broken plumbing or picking up the kids from school or making dinner, and I found myself thinking that with him, I didn't feel like a wife or a mother, but just a woman, Ashley, the one who once painted autumn trees and believed that life was an adventure. The first temptation came quietly. It wasn't a kiss, not a touch, but a look. We'd finished training, and I was sitting on a bench, wiping sweat from my face, and he'd squatted down next to me to show me how to stretch properly. His hand accidentally touched my shoulder, and he looked at me not like a coach, but like a man. His eyes, dark green with long lashes, lingered on me a little too long, and I felt my heart pound, the blood rush to my cheeks. I turned away, muttered something unintelligible, and quickly walked to the locker room. But that moment stayed with me. I thought about him all evening, while I cooked dinner for James and the kids, while I checked Molly's homework, while I listened to Sam talk about his football game. I thought about Thomas. I knew he knew I was married. I never took my wedding ring off, and he'd seen it from the start. But he didn't seem to care. He didn't ask about James, didn't mention him, and I was grateful for that. Because when I was with Thomas, I could pretend my other life, the life with the mortgage and the TA meetings and the endless to-do lists didn't exist. It was a pause, a respite, a moment when I could be less the Ashley who'd faded into routine and more the Ashley who could still laugh and flirt and feel wanted. But I wasn't prepared for it to become something more. I was fighting with myself. Every morning, when I looked in the mirror, I reminded myself that I loved James. He was my home, my anchor. He was the man who held my hand when I gave birth to Sam, who stayed up at night with Molly when she was sick. He was the man who, despite his love of order, tolerated my scattered brushes and paint stains on the kitchen table. I didn't want to lose him, but I couldn't stop thinking about Thomas. Everything changed one night, 3 months into my training. I was staying late at the gym, not on purpose, but Thomas and I had just gotten to talking after class. He suggested we grab some water at the cafe across the street, and for some reason, I said yes. We sat at a table, drinking iced tea, and he looked at me like I was the only woman in the world. He said, "Ashley, you know you're special, right?" And I felt something inside me crack, not from his words, but from how much I wanted to hear them. I wanted to be special, not just to the kids, not just to James, but to someone who saw me for who I was now, not who I was 18 years ago. We kissed that night, in the car, in the parking lot of the gym. It was quick, almost casual, but I knew it wasn't casual. I could have stopped, I could have walked away, but I didn't. And after that, everything changed. We started seeing each other more often, not just at the gym, but at cafes, in the park, in little nooks and crannies where no one knew us. I told myself it wasn't a betrayal. I'd go home to James, cook him dinner, kiss him goodnight, like nothing had changed. I told myself I was taking a break from the routine, that this wasn't love, it was just a way to feel alive. Thomas didn't ask me to leave my husband. He rarely talked about the future. He was as light as the wind, always in the present, always in the moment. And I allowed myself to drown in this moment, because it was so bright, so alive, unlike my daily life, where everything was scheduled by the hour. But every time I returned home, I felt guilt squeeze my heart. I looked at James, at his tired eyes after a day in the workshop, at his hands smelling of varnish and wood, and I thought, what am I doing? Why can't I stop? I wrote the letter 6 months into the affair, not because I wanted to come clean, but because I couldn't keep it inside any longer. I wasn't going to give it to James, it was my way of getting it all out on paper so I wouldn't go crazy. I hid it in a drawer, under my socks, thinking he'd never find it. But looking back now, maybe, deep down, I wanted him to know. Because I was tired of being two different women, the one who loved her husband and the one who cheated on him. I wanted someone to make the choice for me. I sat in my car, parked outside my house, and looked at the lights in the windows. James was probably out there, watching TV or fixing something in the garage. Sam and Molly must be doing homework or arguing over the remote. My family, my life. And I knew that if I walked into that house, I would be Ashley again, wife, mother, teacher. But part of me, the part that had kissed Thomas in the parking lot, wanted to stay outside, in the dark, where I could just be me. Alive, wanted, special. And I hated myself for it. I sat in my car, parked in a deserted lot by the river, watching the water flow lazily under the gray Savannah sky. The windshield was covered in tiny beads of rain, and I ran my finger across the cold glass, making meaningless patterns. Next to me, on the passenger seat, was my gym bag, with a bottle of water sticking out and a towel that still smelled like the gym. But I wasn't at the gym. Not today. Today, I was here with Thomas in his car, a few miles from home, where James was probably tinkering with something in the garage and Sam and Molly were arguing over whose turn it was to pick the movie. It was one of those moments that became my second life, a secret hidden from everyone, even myself, if I could fool myself. It all started so innocently that I still can't pinpoint exactly when I crossed the line. After that first kiss in the gym parking lot, I tried to convince myself that it was a mistake, an accident, a flicker that could be extinguished if I just pretended it never happened. I went home that night and hugged James, kissed his cheek while he was reading something on his tablet, and told myself that everything would be like before. But I couldn't stop thinking about Thomas, about the look in his eyes, the way his hand lingered on my shoulder just a little too long, the way his voice was low and husky when he said, "Ashley, you're special." Those words were like a spark that ignited something inside me that I'd long forgotten, a desire to be seen, to be wanted, to be alive. The next workout, I tried to keep my distance. I avoided his eyes, focused on the bar, on counting my reps, on breathing. But he was there, adjusting my stance, joking, as if nothing had changed, and I realized I didn't want him to stop. I wanted him to look at me, talk to me, touch me, even if it was just the briefest of touches, showing me how to hold the weights. I felt guilty, but the guilt was strangely sweet, like forbidden fruit you're tasting for the first time. We started seeing each other outside the gym a couple of weeks after that kiss. At first, it was just casual, coffee at a little dive on the outskirts of town where no one I knew went. I told myself it was just friendship, that I was just enjoying the company of someone who didn't know me as James's wife or Sam and Molly's mom. Thomas was as light as a summer breeze. He didn't ask about the bills, or how my day at school was, or if I needed to pick up anything at the store. He asked about my paintings, how I felt when I painted, what I dreamed about. And I answered, cautiously at first, and then more freely, as if I were throwing off a heavy backpack I'd been carrying for years. One day, he suggested we take a walk through the park by the river. It was early summer, the air was warm, and it smelled of grass and magnolia blossoms. We walked along the path, and he told me about his childhood, about how he dreamed of becoming a footballer, but a knee injury put an end to his plans. I listened, and I liked the way he spoke with a slight mockery of himself, but without bitterness. He was so alive. Not like James, whose life was built on a ruler, where each day was similar to the one before. Thomas was chaotic, spontaneous, and I felt how his energy was infecting me, awakening something that I had long buried under layers of routine. We stopped by an old oak tree, and he looked at me in a way that made my heart skip a beat. "Ashley," he said quietly, "you know you're beautiful, right?" I laughed, waved him off, muttered something about being 40 and a mother of two, but he shook his head. "You don't understand. You're not just beautiful. You're like a painting you could spend hours looking at." I froze, unsure what to say. No one had said that to me in a long time. James had told me he loved me, told me I was good-looking, but this was different. It was familiar, expected. But Thomas's words were like a sip of water after a long drought. We kissed again, there, under the oak tree, and this time I didn't stop. I didn't run away, didn't turn away, didn't tell myself it was a mistake. I let myself drown in that moment, in his warmth, in his scent, a mix of cologne and something fresh, as if he were always outdoors. It was like jumping off a cliff, terrifying, but so exciting that I couldn't stop. After that, we started seeing each other more often. Coffee gave way to long walks, walks to dinners in small restaurants outside the city, where I wasn't afraid of being seen by someone I knew. We drove to the river, sat in his car, listened to music, talked about everything and nothing. Sometimes we were just silent, and this silence was so comfortable, so easy, that I forgot about my other life. But every time I came home, I felt the guilt eating away at me like rust slowly eating away at metal. I looked at James, at his tired face, at his hands smelling of boat varnish, and I thought, what am I doing? Why can't I stop? I loved him. I knew it. He was my home, my anchor, the man who was there when I had Sam, when I cried with exhaustion, when Molly was sick, and I lay awake at night. He was the man who tolerated my scattered brushes, my fits of inspiration when I would paint until 3 in the morning, forgetting everything else. But with Thomas, I felt different. Not a wife, not a mother, just a woman. Ashley, the one who once danced in the kitchen and believed that life was an adventure. I started making excuses for myself. At first, they were little thoughts that I pushed away, but they kept coming back like waves crashing on the shore. I told myself I wasn't betraying James. I was coming home. I was making dinners, checking homework, hugging him good night. I was a good wife, a good mother. This with Thomas had been a break, a moment when I could be myself, not who everyone else saw me as. I told myself this wasn't love, this wasn't an affair, it was just a way to feel alive. I deserved this, didn't I? After all these years of giving myself to my family, my job, my home, I deserved a little freedom, a little myself. But the longer it went on, the harder it was to hold on to these two lives. I found myself comparing them. James was as reliable as an old oak tree, strong, stable, but sometimes so. Predictable. He planned everything, from our vacations to how we would spend our weekends. He fixed everything that was broken, but he never asked what was broken in me. and Thomas. He was like a river, flowing, unpredictable, full of life. He didn't promise me anything, didn't make plans, but every time I was with him, I felt my heart beat faster, as if I were 20 again, full of dreams and hopes. We met wherever we could hide from prying eyes. Sometimes it was his apartment small, with a minimum of furniture, but with huge windows through which the sunlight poured. I loved to sit on his couch, drink the wine that he bought especially for me, and listen to him tell stories about his travels. He was not one to sit still, and his stories about hiking in the mountains, surfing on the coast, sleeping under the stars fascinated me. I imagined myself next to him, free, without the burden of responsibility, without a schedule, without a sense of duty. But then I returned home, and reality washed over me like a cold shower. One day, about 4 months later, we drove out into the countryside to a small lake I'd never heard of. It was his place, he said, where he liked to go when he wanted to get away from it all. We sat on the bank, throwing stones into the water, and he took my hand. His fingers were warm and strong, and I felt my body respond to his touch, as if I'd been made for him. We made love there, on the grass, under the stars, and it was so different from anything I'd ever known. With James, sex had been warm and familiar, like coming home. With Thomas, it had been a storm wild and uncontrollable, full of a passion that left me breathless. And in that moment, I didn't think about the guilt, or James, or the children. I was just Ashley, and I was alive. But then, lying in his arms, looking up at the stars, I felt something inside me clench. I thought of Sam showing me his drawing yesterday, a football pitch drawn with such care that I couldn't help but smile. I thought of Molly leaving me a note on the fridge, "Mom, you're the best." I thought of James kissing my forehead that morning before he went to his workshop, and I cried. Thomas hugged me tighter, asking what was wrong, but I couldn't explain. How do you explain that you love your family but can't stop yourself from destroying it? I started writing a letter 6 months later. Not for James, but for myself. I sat at the kitchen table while everyone else was asleep, pouring out onto paper everything I couldn't say out loud. I wrote about Thomas, about how he made me feel alive, and how I hated myself for it, but couldn't stop. I wrote about James, about how much I loved him, but how tired I was of being invisible. I hid the letter in a drawer under a pile of socks, thinking it would never be found. But somewhere deep down, I knew it was a lie. I wanted him to know. I wanted him to stop me because I couldn't do this myself. I came home that night, after the lake, and looked at James asleep on the couch. His face was so familiar, so close, that I felt my heart break. I wanted to lie down next to him, to hold him, to tell him everything was going to be okay. But I couldn't, because I knew I was too far gone. For 6 months, I'd been living two lives, and each one was tearing me apart. I was the Ashley who loved her husband, and the Ashley who was kissing another man under the stars, and I didn't know how to reconcile these two women without destroying everything I had. I sat at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning, the house silent except for the occasional creak of old floorboards and the distant hum of the refrigerator. In front of me lay a sheet of paper, a blank canvas I hadn't touched in months. My hand wrapped around the pen, but my fingers didn't move. I stared at the blank page, and it felt like a mirror, a reflection of everything I couldn't say out loud. Outside, Savannah slept in the warm southern night, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to jump or retreat. The letter I was about to write wasn't just words. It was my cry, my confession, my way of letting out what was eating away at me like acid. But why couldn't I say it to James's face? Why did I choose paper over talking? And why the hell did I let this get this far in the first place? 6 months ago, I started an affair with Thomas, and since then my life has been split in two. There was Ashley, who came home, cooked dinner, checked Sam and Molly's homework, and kissed James goodnight. And there was the other Ashley, the one who sneaked out to meet Thomas at a cafe outside of town, in his apartment with the big windows, by the river under the stars. These two women lived inside me, and I hated them both. One for betraying her family, the other for pretending like nothing was happening. I was tired of being both. I was tired of lying, tired of hiding, tired of feeling like every step I took was another nail in our family's coffin. And yet I couldn't stop. Thomas was like a drug, not because I loved him, no. Love was what I felt for James, for his reliability, his quiet strength, his habit of leaving coffee on the table for me when he went to his studio. Thomas was different. He was a flash, an adrenaline rush, a moment when I forgot that I was 40, that I was a mother, that my life was an endless to-do list. With him, I was free, light, desired. But every time I came home, I felt that freedom turned into chains. Guilt was my constant companion, and I didn't know how to get rid of it except by pouring it all out on paper. I started writing a letter, not for James, but for myself. It was an attempt to make sense of who I was and what I had done. I sat in the darkness, lit only by the dim light of the lamp above my desk, and the words spilled out like water from a cracked dam. I wrote about Thomas, how he made me feel alive, how his look, his touch, his words brought out the girl in me who had once danced in the rain and dreamed big. I wrote about James, how much I loved him, how he had been my home, my refuge, but how I was starting to suffocate in this house, where everything was so predictable, so right. I wrote about my guilt, how it ate away at me every time I looked at Sam, who was so much like my father, or at Molly, who had inherited my passion for drawing. I wrote because I couldn't keep it inside, because the words I couldn't say out loud were choking me. But why not say it out loud? That was the question that tormented me more than anything. I imagined myself sitting across from James, looking into his eyes warm and brown, with the slight crinkles at the corners that appeared when he laughed. I imagined myself saying, "James, I cheated on you." And every time I tried to imagine that conversation, my throat tightened, as if someone were tightening a noose around it. I couldn't do it. Not because I was afraid of his anger. James never yelled, or broke things, or lost control. He was the kind of man who fixed anything that broke, whether it was a boat or our old dishwasher. But I knew those words would break him, and I wasn't sure I could watch the man I loved fall apart. I was afraid not only of his pain, but of what he would see in me. That he would see not the Ashley he had known for 18 years, but a stranger, capable of betrayal. I was afraid he would ask, "Why?" And I didn't know how to answer. Because I was tired. Because I was lonely, even with him. Because I wanted to feel young, wanted, alive. All of these answers seemed pathetic, empty, like the excuses of a child caught stealing candy. But they were true. And the truth was so fragile, so ugly, I couldn't bear to say it out loud. Writing became my way of speaking without speaking. I wrote because paper doesn't look at you with pain in its eyes. The paper doesn't ask, "How could you?" Paper simply accepts your words, no matter how dirty they are. I sat at the table, and the pen glided across the page, leaving behind marks that were both a release and a condemnation. I wrote about how the affair had begun, about how Thomas had made me feel like someone I no longer was. I wrote about my feelings for James, about how I still loved him despite everything I'd done. I wrote about Sam and Molly, about how their faces, a mixture of our features, reminded me that I couldn't just walk away. And I wrote about my guilt, how it seeped into every moment of my life, even the ones with Thomas, even the ones I laughed at, because even my laughter was poison now. When I finished, the page was covered in words, ragged and smudged in places because my hands were shaking and tears were dripping onto the paper. I reread it, and every word hit me like a blow. I didn't want James to find this letter. I hid it in a drawer, under a pile of his socks, somewhere I thought he'd never look. But deep down, I knew it was a lie. I wanted him to find it. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I was tired of carrying this secret alone. I wanted him to make the choice for me because I couldn't. Should I leave or should I stay? The question was like a knife I'd stabbed into my own heart. I pictured myself leaving, packing my suitcase, getting into my car, driving off to the unknown. Maybe to Thomas. Maybe to another city where no one knew me as James's wife or Sam and Molly's mother. I pictured a new life, free and easy, where I could draw and laugh and be the Ashley who danced in the rain. But then I thought about Sam, the way he looked at me when I helped him with math, his serious eyes so like James's. I thought about Molly, the pictures she proudly showed me, her small hand in mine when we went to the park. And I thought about James, the way he hugged me in the morning, the way his scent, a mix of varnish and wood and coffee, felt like home to me. And I knew I couldn't leave. Not because I lacked courage, but because I didn't want to lose them. But staying wasn't any easier. Staying meant living with guilt, with this secret I carried inside me like a stone. Staying meant looking at James and knowing that I had betrayed him. Staying meant continuing to see Thomas because I wasn't sure I could stop. He was my escape, my way of breathing when the routine was suffocating me. But every time I was with him, I felt a part of me die, the part that still loved James, that wanted to be a good wife, a good mother. I sat at the table, clutching a crumpled sheet of paper, and asked myself, who am I? I wasn't the girl who drew autumn trees and laughed at James's bluntness. I wasn't the wife who promised to love him forever while standing in a white dress at church. I wasn't the mother Sam and Molly deserved. I was a woman lost somewhere in between all of those roles, and I didn't know how to find myself again. The letter was my cry for help, but I didn't know who it was addressed to. James? Myself? God? I wasn't religious, but I prayed that night at the kitchen table, praying for someone to show me the way. I wanted to be honest, but honesty scared me. I wanted to be free, but freedom meant losing everything I loved. I wanted to be myself, but I didn't know who I was. I folded the letter and hid it in a drawer, thinking it would stay there forever. But I knew that wasn't true. Somewhere deep inside, I wanted James to find it. I wanted him to know, to stop me, to save me from myself. Because I couldn't do this on my own. I didn't know how to choose between two lives, between two women fighting inside me. And I was afraid that whatever choice I made, it would destroy everything I had. I got up from the table, turned off the lamp, and went to bed. James was asleep on our bed, his breathing even and calm. I lay down next to him, trying not to wake him, and closed my eyes. But sleep would not come. I lay in the dark, listening to his breathing, and thought about the letter, about Thomas, about my guilt. And I knew that no matter what happened, my life would never be the same again. James. I drove back to Savannah, and every turn in the highway felt like a step back into the abyss. The road was familiar. I'd passed these fields, these groves, these gas stations 100 times, but now it all felt foreign, as if someone had painted the world gray while I wasn't looking. Ashley's letter, crumpled but still stinging, lay in my jacket pocket, and I could feel its weight as if it were made of lead. I hadn't slept in more than 24 hours since I'd found it in my dresser drawer, since my life, which I'd thought was so well planned, had crumbled in an instant. I'd left yesterday, leaving everything behind, getting in my car and just driving, thinking that the distance would help me breathe. But it hadn't. Wherever I went, I carried her words, her confession, her betrayal with me, and I knew I couldn't run forever. I had to go back, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know what else to do. The sun was setting, filling the sky with crimson light as I pulled into the driveway of our house. The house looked the same as it always did, old, with peeling paint on the porch, a bed of daisies that Ashley had planted, a basketball hoop over the garage where Sam practiced on weekends. But now it felt foreign to me, like the set of a movie I no longer wanted to be in. I sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel, trying to brace myself for what was waiting for me inside. I knew she was there. I knew she was waiting for me. I knew she knew I'd found the letter. And I wasn't sure I was ready to have this conversation, but I couldn't hide anymore. I stepped out of the car, my legs feeling heavy, like I was wading through knee-deep water. The door to the house was unlocked. Ashley never locked it when she was home, and that always irritated me. Savannah is a safe place, she'd said, and I'd grumbled that she was too trusting. Now I was thinking that maybe she was right. Maybe the danger wasn't outside, but inside. Inside her. Inside us. I walked into the living room, and there she was. Ashley was sitting on the couch, hunched over, as if trying to hide from the world. There was a mug of coffee on the table in front of her, long gone cold, judging by the thin film on the surface. Her eyes were red, tear-stained, and I felt something inside me tighten, not with pity, but with pain, with the realization that the woman I'd loved for 18 years was now almost a stranger. She looked up at me, and there was so much in her eyes, fear, guilt, desperation, that I almost turned away. But I couldn't. I had to go through with this. "James," she said quietly, her voice shaking as if she was afraid it would break. "You're back." I nodded, not trusting my voice. I dropped my keys on the table by the door, and the sound of metal on wood was louder than I expected, like a gunshot in the silence. I stood in the doorway, hesitant to move closer, as if there was an invisible wall between us. The letter in my pocket seemed alive, pulsing, demanding that I speak. "You found it," she said, not a question but a statement. Her hands, where they lay in her lap, clenched into fists, and I noticed her fingers trembling. "The letter." "Yes," I said, and my voice was colder than I expected. I didn't want to be cold. I wanted to scream, wanted to ask how she could, wanted to smash something to release the anger that was boiling inside me. But I couldn't. I was James Harper, the man who always kept his cool, who fixed everything that broke, who planned his life like a military operation. And now I stood here in my own living room, and I didn't know how to fix it. She looked down, her lips trembled, and I knew she was about to speak. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it, but I didn't stop her. "I didn't want to tell you," she began, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. "I wanted to stop. I really did. But—" "But," I interrupted, and my voice sounded like a blade, sharp and cold. I didn't mean for it to sound like that, but I couldn't stop myself. I felt the anger I'd been suppressing all this time rising like a wave. "But what, Ashley?" She flinched, as if my words had struck her. She looked up, and I saw tears in them, but they didn't touch me. Not now, not after what I'd read. "I felt bad," she said, her voice a little louder but still shaking. "I felt old, invisible. I looked in the mirror and I didn't see myself. And he just saw me as a woman." I felt my jaw clench so hard my teeth ached. Him, Thomas. That guy, the trainer from the gym who she said brought life into her. I pictured him, young, with his perfect body, with that cocky confidence I'd seen in guys like him when I was in the army. And I pictured her with him, laughing, beaming, the way she'd been when we first met. The thought was like a knife stabbing into my heart. "I saw you as a wife," I said, and my voice was calm, too calm, like the calm before the storm. "The mother of my children, a partner, a family." She was silent, her eyes were full of tears, but she did not look away. I waited for her to say something, to justify herself, to explain, but she just looked at me, and this silence was worse than any words. "Do you want to be with him?" I asked directly, because I needed to know. I needed to hear it from her, even if I was afraid of the answer. "With Thomas?" She shook her head, so quickly that her hair fell in front of her face. "No," she said, her voice firmer than before. "It was a mistake. I ended it. I tried. I thought you'd understand." "Understand?" I almost laughed, but the laugh caught in my throat, bitter and harsh. "Understand what, Ashley? That you slept with another husband for 6 months because you felt old? That you wrote me a letter instead of saying it to my face? That you lied to me, came home, kissed me like nothing happened?" "I didn't lie." Her voice broke, and she jumped up from the couch, her hands shaking. "I loved you. I still love you. But I was choking, James. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you." "You didn't mean to hurt me." I took a step toward her, and she backed away, as if she was afraid I'd do something I'd never done. "You think that letter didn't hurt? You think I don't feel like everything we had fell apart?" She covered her face with her hands, and I heard her sob. Part of me wanted to go over, to hold her, to tell her it would be okay. But another part, a big part, couldn't. I saw her with him in my head, and it was like poison, poisoning everything I'd ever felt. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice quieter but not softer. "Why didn't you come to me and tell me you were feeling bad? I would have listened. I would have tried to understand." "You wouldn't understand," she said, dropping her hands. Her face was wet with tears, but she looked at me with a kind of desperate determination. You always fix things, James. You fix boats, you fix the house, you fix anything that breaks. But you didn't see me. You didn't see me breaking. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words stuck. I wanted to say that I saw her, that I always saw her, that I loved her for who she was. But I remembered the last few months, her late arrivals from the gym, her distant gaze, her smile that seemed a little less bright. I noticed it, but I didn't ask. I thought she was just tired, that it was temporary, that everything would work out on its own. I was so busy with my studio, my plans, my belief that our lives were under control, that I didn't notice her slipping away. I tried, I said finally, my voice almost a whisper. I tried to be a good husband. I worked, I took care of us, the kids. I thought that's what you needed. I needed you, she said, and her words hit me like a slap in the face. Not the money, not the house, not your workshop. You, the guy who laughed when I splashed water on him at the beach, the one who looked at me like I was his whole world. I felt the anger rising again, but now it was mixed with something else, with pain, with a sense of failure. I'm still that guy, I said, but you chose someone else. I didn't choose him, she nearly screamed. It wasn't a choice, James. It was like falling. I didn't want it. I tried to stop. I wrote this letter because I couldn't keep it to myself, but I couldn't tell you to your face. I was afraid. What were you afraid of? I asked, my voice cold again. That I would leave? That I would stop loving you? Or that I would see who you really are? She froze, her eyes widening as if I'd hit her, and I felt a pang of guilt, but I didn't stop. You think I don't see you? I saw you every day, Ashley. I saw you when you were painting, when you sang with the kids, when you were tired after work. I saw you when you were happy and when you were sad. But you didn't give me a chance. You went to him. I know, she whispered, and her voice was so quiet I could barely hear her. I know what I did, and I hate myself for it. But I don't want him, James. I want us. I want what we had back. I looked at her, and there was such pleading, such pain in her eyes that I almost believed her. But then I remembered her words in the letter. I just wanted to feel alive. And I realized I couldn't forget that. Not now. Maybe never. I understand, I said, my voice as hard as steel. That's why I'm leaving. Her face went pale, and she took a step toward me, holding out her hand as if she could stop me. James, please, she said. Don't go. We can fix this. I'm done with him, I swear. I want to be with you, with the kids. I'll do anything. You already did, I said, and the words were like a knife that I stabbed into both of us. You made your choice, Ashley, and now I'm making mine. I turned to the door, feeling her gaze burning into my back. I heard her sob, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. If I looked at her, I would stay, and I wasn't sure I could live with her, knowing she was with someone else, knowing I wasn't what she needed. I left the house, got into the car, and drove away. The road lay before me again, endless, like my questions. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know if I'd come back, but I knew I couldn't stay. Not now, not after this. I drove down the highway, the night settling around the car like a dark blanket, drowning out everything but the sound of my tires and my own thoughts. The headlights picked out patches of asphalt, and I stared at them, trying not to think about what I'd left behind. The house where Ashley and I had lived for 18 years. The living room where Sam and Molly played board games while Ashley and I laughed at their arguments. The kitchen where she made her coffee too strong, and I grumbled about how bitter it was. It all felt like a memory that wasn't mine, a photo in an album that belonged to someone else. I'd left after our conversation, after her tears and pleas had failed to stop me. I'd told her I was leaving, and I'd meant it. But now, in the silence of the car, I could feel my heart tightening with pain, with fear, with the thought of what would happen next. Not just to me, to us, to our family. I knew I had to tell the kids. Sam and Molly deserved the truth, or at least some of it, the part I could get out without completely shattering their world. But how do I tell two teenagers that the family they thought was solid is falling apart? How do I explain that their mother, the one they adored, had done something I still couldn't comprehend? And how do I explain that I, their father, the one who had always been there, was leaving because I couldn't stay? I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, trying to find words that wouldn't hurt them the way her words in the letter had hurt me. I pulled into a motel on the outskirts of Savannah, some anonymous place with a neon sign that blinked red. The room smelled of damp and cheap detergent, but I didn't care. I threw my bag on the bed and sat, staring into space. My phone was next to me, the screen glowing with notifications texts from Ashley missed calls. I didn't read them. I wasn't ready. Instead, I dialed my brother, Ted, who lived in Charleston, 2 hours away. He was the only one I could tell, the only one who might not judge. James, his voice was sleepy but concerned. It was already past midnight. What happened? Where are you? At the motel, I said, my voice sounding hollow, like it belonged to someone else. I left home. There was so much silence on the other end of the line that I thought the connection had been cut off. Then Ted asked, Ashley, the kids, what happened? I told him. Not everything, not about the letter, not about Thomas. I couldn't say his name out loud. But I told him that Ashley and I couldn't be together anymore, that I couldn't stay. Ted listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he sighed so heavily that I could feel his weariness through the phone. Get your stuff and come see me, he said. Don't sit in that damn motel. We'll figure this out. I agreed because I didn't know what else to do. But before I left, I had to talk to the kids. I couldn't just disappear and leave them wondering what had happened to their father. I returned to Savannah the next day, feeling like every mile was bringing me closer to the conversation I dreaded most. Ashley was home when I walked in. She was sitting in the kitchen, her eyes red as if she hadn't slept all night. Sam and Molly were at school, and I was grateful for that. I didn't want them to see me like this, with my bag over my shoulder, my face giving away everything I knew. Ashley stood up as I walked in, her hands fiddling nervously with the hem of her sweater. James, she said quietly, you're back. Not exactly, I answered, my voice as cold as yesterday. I came to get my things, and to talk to the kids. Her face went pale, and she took a step toward me. Please, don't tell them. Not everything. They won't understand. They deserve to know, I interrupted. Not everything, Ashley, but the truth. They're not stupid. They'll sense something's wrong if I just disappear. She nodded, her lips trembling, but she didn't object. I could see she wanted to say something, to beg, to plead, but I didn't give her a chance. I went into the bedroom, gathered a few more things, shirts, shoes, papers. Each item I put in my bag was a farewell to the life I knew. I stopped at the dresser where I found the letter and felt the anger rise again. But I suppressed it. Not now. Not in front of the children. Sam and Molly got home from school around 3. I was sitting in the living room, on the same couch where Ashley and I watched movies on Saturdays. They walked in, dropped their backpacks by the door, and their faces lit up when they saw me. Daddy! Molly ran up and hugged me, her blonde hair smelling of shampoo and something sweet, like candy. Where have you been? Mom said you were out on business. Sam stood a little distance away, his eyes, brown like mine, wary. He was older, 15, and I knew how he knew when something was wrong. Everything okay? He asked, and his voice was so mature that I felt a twinge of pride and pain. I took a deep breath and looked at them. Ashley was standing in the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, as if she was trying to keep herself from interfering. Guys, I began, trying to keep my voice from shaking. I need to tell you something. It's not easy, but you deserve to know. Molly frowned, her hand still on my shoulder. What's wrong, Dad? I looked at Ashley, and her eyes begged me to be careful. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them that their mother had ruined everything, but I couldn't. Not for her, but for them. Your mother and I, we're going through a tough time right now, I said, choosing my words as if I were navigating a minefield. We love you, and that will never change. But I need to go away for a while, to think things through. Leave? Molly's voice wavered, and I saw her eyes fill with tears. Where? Why? Sam stepped closer, his face tense. Is this about you and Mom? Are you getting a divorce? I felt my throat tighten. I didn't want to lie, but the truth was too hard. We don't know what's going to happen next, I said. But I promise you'll always be my children, and I'll always be there when you need me. That's not an answer, Sam said, his voice sharp, almost angry. What happened? Why can't you stay? Ashley stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. Sam, it's not that simple. Dad and we're trying to figure this out. But it's not your fault. Don't ever think it's because of you. Molly began to cry, burying her face in my shoulder, and I held her, feeling her small body shake. Sam looked at me, and in his eyes was a mixture of anger and pain that I knew all too well. It was my pain reflected in him. I'll be in Charleston at Uncle Ted's, I said. You can call me anytime. I'll come if you need me, I promise. You're just leaving us, Sam said, and his words were like a blow. You're just leaving, that's all. I'm not leaving you, I said, my voice breaking. I'll never leave you, but I need time. I hugged them both, feeling Molly cling to me and Sam standing still, as if he didn't want to give in. I knew he was angry, and I didn't blame him. I would have been angry too if my father had left without a clear explanation. When I left the house, Ashley was standing at the door. James, she said quietly, please don't do this. I already did, I replied and left without looking back. In Charleston, Ted greeted me with a beer and silent understanding. His house was small but cozy, overlooking the bay, and I slept on the living room couch, feeling like an outsider. I called a lawyer the next day. Divorce. The word sounded like a death sentence, but I saw no other way. I couldn't live with Ashley knowing she was with someone else. I couldn't look at her without seeing him. The lawyer, a woman with a tired voice, said the process would be simple if we agreed on the children and the property. I didn't want to divide anything. All I wanted was freedom. I called my parents, told them. My mother was crying, my father was silent, but I could hear his disappointment through the phone. Are you sure, son? He asked. Family is not something you abandon. I didn't answer. I wasn't sure of anything except that I couldn't go back. Neighbors, friends, co-workers, the word spread fast. Someone called, someone wrote, asking what was wrong, but I didn't answer. Mrs. Claire, our neighbor, sent a message, James, we are praying for you. I didn't answer. I didn't want their prayers. I wanted it all to be a dream. Ashley stayed at home with the kids. I called Sam and Molly every day, but Sam was cold and Molly cried. I felt like the worst father in the world, but I couldn't go back. Not now. I worked with Ted at his construction company to keep my hands and mind busy, but every night, sitting on the porch with a beer, I thought about her tear-stained eyes, about her words. I wanted to feel alive, and I hated her for it. But I hated myself, too, for not noticing, for not being what she needed. I left, but a part of me remained in that house, in the bedroom where we slept, in the workshop where I fixed boats, in the living room where we were a family, and I didn't know if I could ever take that part back. I woke up at first light, the sky just beginning to turn pink over Charleston Bay, the air thick with salt and the smell of wet wood. My new house, a small one-story house with faded blue paint and a creaky porch, sat at the water's edge, where the waves lazily licked the wooden pier. Every morning, I'd grab a mug of coffee, black, no sugar, and step out onto the porch, listening to the seagulls screaming over the bay and the distant hum of fishing boats. This was my new life, alone but peaceful. After everything that had happened, the letter, Ashley, her betrayal, our conversation, me leaving, I'd found refuge here, in this small town in South Carolina, where no one knew me as a husband or a father or a man whose life had fallen apart. I was just James, a guy who fixed boats and sometimes went out to sea with a fishing pole. and I liked it. Or at least I learned to. The divorce happened quietly, almost unnoticed, as if Ashley and I had agreed not to make a big deal out of it. We signed the papers at the lawyer's in a small office that smelled of paper and old carpet. The house was hers. I didn't want it to be hers. It was hers, the place where she'd raised our children, where her brushes and paints lay on the kitchen table, where her daisies bloomed in the flower bed. I couldn't imagine being there without her, without Sam and Molly, without our life, which I now realized had been an illusion. The kids were almost adults. Now Sam was 17, Molly was 14, and I knew they could cope, even if my absence hurt them. I called them every day, texted them, visited once a month when they asked. But I couldn't stay in Savannah. Not after everything. I bought this little house in Charleston, in a town called Folly Beach, with my savings and some of the money I'd earned from selling my shop. It was old, with a leaky roof and windows that were sticking, but I saw potential. I'd always had a knack for fixing broken things, boats, cars, houses, everything except my family. I spent the first few weeks fixing it, patching the roof, painting the walls, replacing the rotted boards on the porch. Working with my hands was comforting, a sense of control I'd lost when I found that letter. Every nail I hammered, every board I sanded, was a step toward putting myself back together. My days now began the same way. I'd rise at dawn, make coffee in an old coffee maker I'd found at a local flea market, and walk down to the pier. Sometimes I'd just sit there, looking out at the water. Sometimes I'd grab a rod and catch a fish base or mullet, nothing fancy, but the process was relaxing. I wasn't much of a fisherman, but I loved the feel of the rod in my hands, the anticipation of a bite, the silence broken only by the lapping of the waves. It was a time when I didn't have to think not about Ashley, not about Thomas, not about how it had all gone wrong. I just was. And that was enough. On weekdays, I worked in a small shop I rented from an old fisherman named Roy. He was about 20 years older than me, with skin roughened by sun and wind and hands that knew the sea better than I would ever know. Roy rented me a shed by the dock where I repaired boats, everything from small launches to old fishing schooners. The work was familiar, much like it had been in Savannah, but here it was simpler. Clients didn't ask about my life, didn't know that I was married, that I had 2 children, that I had moved away because my wife was sleeping with another man. They just brought their boats, I fixed them, and we went our separate ways. It was honest. It was pure. Sometimes, when I was working on the engine or sanding the body, I found myself thinking about the past. Not about the letter, not about the fight, but about the years when everything was good. I thought about walking around campus with Ashley, her laughing at my jokes, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her paintings. I thought about holding Sam in the hospital, tiny, his fingers wrapped around my pinky. I thought about Molly, a toddler, drawing with crayons on the living room floor, Ashley sitting next to her, showing her how to mix colors. These memories were like old photographs, vibrant but faded around the edges, and I didn't know whether I wanted to keep them or burn them. I called the kids every Sunday. Sam was cold, his answers short, like he was still mad at me for leaving. I didn't blame him. He was a teenager, and his world, like mine, had fallen apart. Molly was different. She chatted, talking about school, about her drawings, about how she missed me. "Dad, when are you coming?" she'd ask, and her voice was so light, so trusting, that I felt like the worst father in the world. I promised to come soon, and I kept my word, but every time I saw them, I saw Ashley too. She was in their faces, in their gestures, in their smiles, and it was like a knife I couldn't pull out. Ashley wrote to me, not often, but regularly. Short messages. "The kids are asking about you." "Sam got an A in math." "Molly drew a picture of you." I answered dryly, monosyllabically, because I didn't know what else to say. I didn't hate her. I wanted to, but I couldn't. Instead, I felt empty, like a part of me was left behind in that house, in that life, and I didn't know how to get it back. She called a couple of times, but I didn't pick up. I wasn't ready to hear her voice, wasn't ready for her excuses, for her tears. I knew she was done with Thomas, she said so the last time we talked, and I believed her, but that didn't change what she'd done. It didn't change the fact that I couldn't look at her anymore without seeing him. My parents called sometimes, but their conversations were guarded, as if they were afraid to hurt me. My mother would ask how I was coping, offer to come over, but I would refuse. "I need time," I would say, and she did not argue, though I could hear her tears through the phone. My father was more silent, but one day he said, "James, you've always been stubborn. Don't let this ruin everything you have." I didn't answer. He didn't know what it was like to find a letter, to learn that the woman you'd loved for 18 years had slept with someone else. He didn't know what it was like to feel like you'd failed, not as a husband, but as a person. I was alone in Folly Beach, but the loneliness wasn't as hard as I expected. I'd grown accustomed to the silence, to the sound of the waves, to the smell of salt and gasoline in the workshop. On weekends, I'd take my boat, an old one I'd rebuilt myself, and head out to sea. I'd fish, or just drift, looking at the horizon where the sky and water met. Out there in the middle of the bay, I could breathe. There were no letters, no betrayals, no past. Just me and the water and the sky. And I'd begin to feel something inside me healing not completely, but piece by piece, like the old boat I'd patched together until it could float again. Sometimes I thought about starting over. Not with Ashley, I wasn't ready to even think about her, but with myself. I joined a local book club, even though I'd never been much of a reader. It was mostly older women and a couple of men who talked about books as if they were saving the world. I stayed quiet at the meetings, but I listened, and it was nice to be around people who didn't know my past, who didn't look at me with pity or curiosity. One day, a woman named Linda, with gray hair and kind eyes, asked me why I didn't talk so much. "You seem like someone who has something to say," she said. I smiled and shrugged, but her words sank in. Maybe I did have something to say. I just didn't know how yet. I started writing letters not to Ashley, not to the kids, but to myself. I'd sit on the porch at night with a pad of paper and a pen and write about what I was feeling, about the anger that still bubbled up inside me when I thought about Thomas, about the pain that came when I thought about Ashley laughing at our wedding, about the love I had for Sam and Molly, who was the only thing keeping me going. I didn't send these letters, didn't show them to anyone. They were my way of sorting things out, as if I could put my thoughts down on paper and find the order I needed. It had been a year since I had left Savannah. I was still fixing boats, still fishing, still calling the kids. Sam had softened, started talking about college, about how he wanted to study engineering like me. Molly sent me her drawings, bright and vibrant, like her mother. I kept them in a drawer in my desk, next to my letters. Ashley wrote less often, but her messages were warm, almost like before. "Sam won the match," she wrote. "Molly wants you to come to her exhibit." I wrote back, but only briefly. I wasn't ready for her. Maybe I never would be. My life in Folly Beach was simple, but in that simplicity I found peace. I rose with the sun, worked, fished, and looked at the stars. I wasn't happy, not yet, but I was at peace. And that was more than I could have hoped for when I found that letter. I didn't know what would happen next. Maybe I'd stay here forever, repairing boats and listening to the sea. Maybe I'd go back to Savannah, to my children, to the life I'd left behind. But for now, I was here, and that was enough. I was learning to live again, one day at a time, and maybe one day I'd find myself not a husband, not a father, just James, the man who could still breathe despite everything. Works. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty mug of coffee I hadn't finished. The morning light was pouring through the window, reflecting off the tile countertop, and I could see the dust motes dancing in its rays, reminding me that life goes on even when it feels like nothing has. The house was quiet, too quiet. Sam was at school, Molly was at a friend's house, and James was somewhere in Charleston, in his new life that I had ruined. I felt it every day, the emptiness he had left, not just in the house, but inside me. The divorce had been finalized 6 months ago, quietly, without a trial, without shouting, as if we were both tired of a war that had never happened anyway. But the silence that followed was louder than any shouting. It was like a shadow that followed me everywhere, a reminder of what I had done. I tried to move on. Everyone said it was what I had to do. My friend Kate, with whom I sometimes drank wine on Fridays, kept saying, "Ashley, you're still young. You're only in your 40s. Start over. Find someone." She said it with such certainty, as if it were so easy to erase 18 years of marriage, to erase the betrayal, to erase the pain in James's eyes as he looked at me that night he found the letter. I smiled at Kate, I nodded, but something inside me was clenching, as if her words were salt on an open wound. I wasn't ready. Or maybe I just didn't know who I was now, without James, without our family, without the life I had destroyed with my own hands. I still had the house, and I was grateful for that, because it was the only thing that kept me going. There were still traces of our lives here, a scratch on the kitchen table where Sam had once tried to carve his name, the old couch where James and I would watch movies while cuddling our kids, the bed of daisies I'd planted when we first moved to Savannah. But now they were like ghosts, reminders of what I'd lost. I walked through the house like it was a museum, touching things that had once been ours, and I felt my heart tighten with regret. I tried to get back to myself, to Ashley who painted, who saw beauty in every brushstroke. I took out my old canvases, set up an easel in the corner of the living room, but every time I picked up a brush, my hand shook. I couldn't paint, not because I had lost my talent, but because I had lost myself. The girl who once sat under an oak tree at the university, painting autumn trees, was gone. In her place was a woman who had cheated on her husband, who had broken up her family, who didn't know how to live with it. I tried dating because I thought it would help. Kate talked me into joining an online dating site, and I laughed at my own awkwardness as I created a profile. Ashley, 41, art teacher, mother of two, loves painting and walking. It sounded so cliched, so unlike me, but I didn't know how to describe myself anymore. I went on a few dates with a man named Paul, who was an accountant and talked about taxes like it was an art form. With David, who was divorced and talked about his ex-wife all the time. With Michael, who was kind but so boring I almost fell asleep at dinner. Each time, I came home feeling emptier than before. They weren't James. They weren't even Thomas. And I hated myself for comparing them, for still thinking about Thomas when I'd sworn he was in the past. Thomas, I ended things with him right after James found the letter. I called him, told him it was over, and he didn't argue. He was like that, light as the wind, unattached. He just nodded, said, "If you change your mind, you know where to find me," and walked away. I thought it would be liberating, but instead I felt empty. Not because I loved him, I didn't. I knew that now. He was an escape for me, a way to feel alive, but he wasn't my home. James was my home, and I had destroyed it. My children were my anchor, but they were different after the divorce. Sam became withdrawn, his answers short and sharp, as if he blamed me for everything. I couldn't blame him. He was old enough to know that something was wrong, and I knew he could sense a lie, even if I wasn't telling him the whole truth. Molly was different. She clung to me as if she were afraid I would leave too. She drew more than she had before, and her drawings were full of bright colors, but I saw a sadness in them. One time she drew a family, the four of us holding hands, and I cried when I saw it, because I knew it would never happen again. I knew I had to talk to them. Not just about the divorce, not just about Dad living in Charleston now, but about why it all happened. I'd been putting this conversation off for months because I was afraid. Afraid of their questions, their pain, their judgment. But I couldn't hide anymore. One night, when Sam came home from practice and Molly was sitting at the table drawing, I gathered up all my courage and said, "Guys, we need to talk." Sam looked at me, his eyes cold, like James's had been the night he left. "About what?" he asked, his voice sharp, like he already knew he didn't want to hear it. Molly looked up from her drawing, her pencil hovering in midair. "About Dad?" she asked quietly. I nodded, feeling my throat tighten. About us. About why everything changed. I sat down at the table across from them, my hands shaking as I clutched my mug of cold tea. "I made a mistake," I began, my voice so weak I barely recognized it. "I did something to hurt Dad, and it's my fault he left." Sam frowned, his arms crossing over his chest. "What did you do?" he asked, and there was such a mixture of anger and fear in his voice that I felt my heart break. I took a deep breath, trying to find the words that wouldn't destroy them. I was with someone else, I said finally, and the words fell into the silence like stones into water. It was wrong. I didn't mean for it to happen, but I did it, and Dad found out. Molly looked at me, her eyes wide as if she couldn't believe it. "You cheated on Daddy?" she asked, and her voice was so small, so fragile, I wanted to disappear. "Yes," I whispered, tears streaming down my cheeks. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't mean for it to end this way. But I was selfish, and I lost him." Sam stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "You destroyed our family," he said, his voice cold as ice. "You did it, and now Dad's gone." "I know," I said, my voice breaking. "I know, Sam, and I'll never forgive myself for it." Molly started crying. Her pencil fell on the table, and I wanted to hug her, but she pulled away. "Why couldn't you just be with Daddy?" she asked. "Why couldn't you be happy with us?" I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to say that I loved them, that I loved James, that I was just lost, but the words felt empty. Instead, I just sat there, crying, until Sam went to his room and Molly ran off to hers, leaving me alone at the table with her drawing, which now felt like a death sentence. The regret didn't come right away. At first, I tried to convince myself that I'd done the right thing by ending things with Thomas, that I could start over, that I could be a good mother even if I hadn't been a good wife. But with each passing day, with each glance from Sam, each drawing from Molly, I felt the regret growing, like a weed I couldn't pull out. I didn't regret Thomas, he was a mistake, a moment of weakness, but that I hadn't talked to James when I'd started to feel invisible. I regretted not telling him how lonely I was, how tired I was of being just a wife and a mother. I regretted choosing to run instead of fight. I wrote to James, sending messages about the kids, their progress, hoping he'd respond with more than "thank you" or "okay." But he was distant, like a star you can see but not touch. I knew he was in Charleston, fixing boats, living his life. I pictured him on the pier, fishing rod in hand, and my heart ached at the thought of him finding peace without me. I wanted to write to him, to tell him I missed him, that I was sorry, that I wanted it all back, but I knew he wasn't ready to hear it. Maybe he never would be. I went back to teaching, to my students, to their drawings that reminded me of who I was. I tried to be a good mother, to be there for Sam and Molly, even when they pushed me away. I went to church on Sundays, even though I wasn't sure I believed in anything anymore. I tried to paint again, but my pictures were dark, full of shadows, as if they reflected what was inside me. Life went on, but it was different. I was different. And every day I woke up thinking that I could have changed everything, if only I had turned to James instead of Thomas when I first felt invisible. But now it was too late, and all I could do was live with the consequences, with the regret, with the hope that one day my children would forgive me, and maybe I would forgive myself. James. The sun was setting over the bay, turning the water shades of orange and pink, and I sat on my dock, fishing even though the fish weren't biting. The quiet of Folly Beach had become my refuge for the past year after the divorce, after Savannah, after everything I'd left behind. I'd grown accustomed to the solitude, to the sound of the waves, the smell of salt and old wood, the rhythm of the days as slow as the tide. My life in Charleston was simple. Weekdays repairing boats at Roy's shop, weekends fishing or reading books I'd borrowed from the local library. I didn't seek anything more. After Ashley, after her letter, after the ache that still lingered deep in my chest, I thought I'd had enough of this, the silence, the work, the sea. But then Laura came along, and everything began to change, so slowly and subtly that I almost didn't notice how she'd become a part of my life. I first saw her at the local market, which was held on Saturdays on the main street. She was standing behind a counter, selling homemade candles that smelled of lavender and sea breeze. Her hair, dark with strands of gray, was pulled back into a messy bun, and she wore a long indigo dress that swung in the wind like sails. But what struck me most were her hands, slender, with long fingers that moved with a certain grace as she passed candles to customers. I had no intention of buying anything, just strolling, but her voice, soft and slightly husky, stopped me. "Try this one," she said, handing me a cedar-scented candle. "It smells like a forest after rain." I smiled, not because I wanted candles, but because her words sounded like music, like something I hadn't heard in a long time. "I'm not a big fan of candles," I replied, but I took it and turned it over in my hands. "But it smells good." She laughed, and her laugh was warm, like she expected nothing but honesty from me. "Then just take a deep breath and imagine you're in the woods. Sometimes that's all it takes to feel alive." I bought a candle, though I didn't know why. I later learned that her name was Laura, and she was 47 and a widow. Her husband, a musician, had died of cancer 5 years earlier, leaving her with a pile of memories and an old piano that she carried with her from town to town. She had settled in Folly Beach a couple of years earlier, renting a small house not far from mine, and making a living selling candles and giving music lessons to local kids. She was nothing like Ashley, not the Ashley I'd met in college, with paint on her jeans and big dreams, nor the one who'd written me a letter full of words that broke my heart. Laura was calm as the sea when it was calm, and in her presence I felt like I didn't have to be anyone but myself. We started dating by chance. I'd go to the market, buy another candle, even though my little house was already full of them, and we'd chat about the weather, the sea, how the local crabs sometimes climbed onto her veranda. She'd talk about her students, about how one boy, barely 10, plays Chopin as if he'd been born with a piano in his hands. I'd talk about boats, about how I love taking apart an engine, finding the fault, and bringing it back to life. These were simple conversations, without innuendo, without expectations, but they were a breath of fresh air after a year spent alone. One night, she invited me to a live music night at a local bar where she sometimes played piano. I wasn't sure I wanted to go. The crowds, the noise, the people who might ask too many questions were intimidating. But something in her voice, her slight smile, made me say yes. The bar was small, with wooden walls covered in old fishing nets and the smell of beer and fried shrimp. Laura sat at the piano, her fingers sliding over the keys, playing something slow, melancholy, but so beautiful that I forgot how to breathe. She didn't sing, but her music spoke for her about loss, about hope, about life going on no matter what. I sat in the corner, sipping my beer, watching her, and for the first time in a long time, I felt my heart pounding with something other than pain. After the performance, she came up to me, her cheeks slightly flushed and her eyes shining. "So, how did you like it?" she asked, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You make me wish I could play," I said, and it was true. I had never understood music the way I understood mechanics, but her playing touched something in me I couldn't explain. She laughed. "Music is like your boats, James. You take something broken and make it whole. Only instead of nuts and bolts, you have notes." We started spending more time together. It wasn't like a romance, at least not in the way I'd known it with Ashley. With Ashley, it was bright, fast, like a fire. We fell in love quickly, married a year later, had kids, built a life. But with Laura, it was different. Slowly, carefully, as if we both knew we carried scars that hadn't healed yet. She spoke of her husband, Michael, with warmth, but no tears. He'd been a guitarist in a local band, and they'd traveled the country until illness stopped him. She spoke of him not as a loss, but as a part of her life that had made her who she was. I respected that. I couldn't talk about Ashley the same way. Her betrayal still stung, and I wasn't ready to share it with Laura. We walked on the beach, drank coffee on her porch, listened to her old records, jazz, blues, sometimes classical. She taught me the difference between Bach and Mozart, and I taught her how a carburetor worked. It was strange but comfortable, as if we were both learning to trust the world again. One day, she invited me over for dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta with sauce from a jar and wine she bought at the supermarket. We sat at her small table, and she told me how, after Michael died, she couldn't play for a year. "The music was his," she said, looking into her glass. "I thought if I ever sat down at the piano again, it would feel like a betrayal. But then I realized he would have wanted me to play." I looked at her calm face, at her hands that still smelled of lavender from the candles, and I thought about how different her words were from everything I'd known with Ashley. Ashley was passion, fire, chaos. She painted as if the world depended on every brushstroke, and I loved her for it. But Laura was different. She was like a river, calm but deep, with a current that could sweep you away if you weren't careful. With Ashley, I always felt like I had to be strong, in control, fix anything that broke. With Laura, I could just be. "What about you?" she asked one day as we sat on the pier watching the sunset. "What did you leave behind?" I froze, unprepared for the question. I'd told her about my shop and about fishing and about Sam and Molly, but I'd never talked about Ashley, never talked about why I was here alone. "A lot," I finally answered, my voice quieter than I'd expected. "Family, the life I thought I knew." She nodded, not pressing for details. "Loss is like a wave," she said. "Sometimes it hits you over the head, and sometimes it just touches your toes. But it always comes." I didn't answer, but her words stayed with me. She didn't ask, didn't push, and I was grateful for that. Ashley was different. She always wanted to talk, analyze, dig into feelings. Sometimes that was great, but other times I felt trapped. Laura gave me space, and I began to realize how much I needed it. We didn't call it a relationship. We didn't hold hands, we didn't kiss, we didn't make plans. But I found myself looking forward to our meetings, smiling when I saw her at the market, thinking about her when I sat on the pier. She became part of my rhythm, like the waves, like working in the studio. And I began to wonder if I could trust someone again, if I could feel anything other than pain again. Sam and Molly noticed that I had changed when I came to Savannah for their school exhibition. Molly hugged me like she always did, but Sam looked at me curiously. "You seem, I don't know, calmer," he said, and I realized he was right. I still missed them, our life, but I was learning to live without the baggage of the past. I told them about Laura, not everything, just that there was a woman who played the piano and made candles. Molly lit up. "Does she paint like Mom?" I shook my head. "No, she's different. She plays music." Sam just nodded, but I could tell he was thinking about Ashley, and I didn't blame him. Ashley wrote to me, as always, about the children, about their lives. I wrote back, but I kept my distance. I didn't hate her, but I couldn't forget. Laura was different. She wasn't part of my past. She wasn't connected to the pain. She was present, and I was starting to think that maybe I had a chance at a future. Not like the one with Ashley, not full of fire and passion, but calm, slow, like the melody Laura played at the bar. And I was ready to learn to live in that rhythm, day by day, note by note. The sun was setting, casting a soft golden light over Folly Beach Bay that reflected off the water like liquid flame. I sat on my pier, the wood planks warm from the day's heat, a bottle of beer in my hands, cold and foggy. Beside me sat Laura, though I knew her now as Margaret, her real name, which she used only with close friends. She'd insisted I call her that one night as we drank wine on her porch, her eyes glittering with laughter. "Laura is for the students and the clients," she'd said, "and Margaret is me." I smiled then, and she'd been Margaret ever since, the woman who'd slipped into my life like a melody you don't notice at first, but then can't stop humming. We sat in silence, listening to the waves lapping against the pier, the seagulls calling in the distance, the wind rustling the tall grass by the shore. It was one of those silences that doesn't weigh you down, doesn't require words, but simply exists as part of the landscape. Margaret sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, her bare feet touching the boards, and in her hands she held a glass of wine that shimmered in the sunset light. Her hair, dark with silver threads, was loose, and the wind played with it like sails. She looked calm, but I knew that there was depth behind that calm, like the sea, which seems smooth on the surface but hides currents that can carry you far away. We had been dating for a few months now, and though we didn't call it a relationship, I could feel something growing between us, slowly, carefully, like a plant pushing through a crack in the rock. We'd walk on the beach, drink coffee, listen to her records, and I'd learn to be with her without comparing her to Ashley, without looking back at the past. But the past was still there, a shadow that followed me, even on the sunniest days. I didn't talk about it, didn't want to, but Margaret, with her quiet insight, sensed it. She never pushed, never asked questions, but her gaze, soft and attentive, told me she saw more than I was letting on. That night, sitting on the pier, she turned to me, her eyes reflecting the sunset, and she said, so quietly I could barely hear, "James, do you still love her?" I froze, the beer bottle halfway to my lips. The question was simple, but it hit me like a wave, unexpected and cold. I knew who she meant. Ashley. The woman who had been my wife for 18 years, the mother of my children, the center of my life before it all fell apart. I hadn't talked about her with Margaret, about the letter, about Thomas, about how her words had torn me apart. But Margaret knew I had a past, that I had come to Folly Beach for a reason, that I was running from something. And now she was asking, and I found myself unable to avoid it. I looked out at the water, the way it sparkled in the last rays of sunlight, and I tried to think of an answer. Do I love Ashley? I've thought about it 1,000 times, sitting on this same pier, fixing boats in the workshop, looking at the stars at night. I thought about her laugh, about the way she danced in the kitchen, about the way her eyes lit up when she painted. I thought about our children, about Sam and Molly, who were a part of us both, about the years we spent together building a life I thought was immutable. But I thought about her letter too, about her words. I just wanted to feel alive. I thought about Thomas, about how she chose him, about how I couldn't be who she needed me to be, and I realized the answer wasn't as simple as I'd like it to be. I smiled, not because the question was funny, but because I suddenly saw myself from the outside, a man who clung to the past like a life preserver, not realizing that it was dragging him down. "No," I said, and my voice was firm but gentle, as if I were saying it not only to her but to myself. I've simply confused habit with love for too long. Margaret looked at me, her eyes attentive but not judgmental. She didn't ask what I meant, didn't demand an explanation. She simply nodded, as if my words were a note she'd been waiting to hear in her melody. "Habit is a powerful thing," she said, sipping her wine. "It can hold you for years, long after love has gone." I nodded, feeling something inside me release, not completely, but enough that I could breathe a little more freely. I thought about Ashley, how I loved her, or thought I did. I loved our life, our home, our children, the routine we'd built. I loved the feeling of control, the assurance that everything was in its place. But love, real love, I wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it had been in the beginning, when we were young, when she'd laughed at my bluntness and I'd admired her passion. But over the years, it had become something else, a habit, a duty, a promise I'd made in church. Standing before her in a suit, she joked made me look too serious. "I don't hate her," I said, looking out at the water. "I thought I did when I found that letter. I was so angry, so hurt. But now, I just want her to be happy. Somewhere out there, with the kids, in the life we built. I just can't be a part of that." Margaret put her hand on my shoulder, her fingers warm despite the cool evening air. "You don't have to be a part of this, James," she said. "You can be here, with yourself, with what you're building now." I looked at her face, lit by the soft light of the sunset, and felt something in my chest unclench. She was right. I was building a new life, not like the one in Savannah, not full of fire and passion, but calm, simple, like the melody she played on the piano. I repaired boats, fished, talked to her, listened to her music, and it was enough. It was more than I expected after everything that had happened. "Tell me about her," Margaret said, her voice soft but not demanding. "Not about what happened, about what she was like." I paused. This was the first time anyone had asked me to talk about Ashley as a person other than a traitor. I took a deep breath and began. "She was bright," I said. "Like the sun, the kind that blinds you if you stare at it too long. She painted, and when she picked up a brush, it was like the whole world stopped. She laughed in a way that made you smile, even if you were in a bad mood. She was chaotic in a good way. She'd throw her paint all over the house, forget where she'd left her keys, sing out of tune, but so sincerely it didn't matter." Margaret listened, her eyes fixed on the water, but I knew she was hearing every word. She sounds like someone who lives life to the fullest, she said. Yes, I replied, but she wanted more, more than I could give, and I don't blame her for that. Not now. I paused, feeling the words settle like dust after a wind. I had spoken the truth. I no longer blamed Ashley. I saw her no longer as a wife who had betrayed me, but as a woman who was lost, just as I had been lost. I couldn't forgive her completely, the pain was still there, deep down, but I could let go. And sitting on that pier, with Margaret, I found myself doing just that, letting go. And you, I asked, turning to her, do you still love him, Michael? She smiled, but her smile was sad, like her music. I'll always love him, she said, but not like before. He was a part of me, like Ashley is a part of you, but I've learned to live without him, and I'm learning to live with what I have now. I nodded, feeling her words resonate with me. We were alike, two people who had lost their past lives, but had found a way to move on. Not fast, not loudly, but slowly, quietly, like the waves crashing against the pier. We sat there for a long time, until the sun had disappeared below the horizon and the sky was a deep blue, strewn with stars. Margaret finished her wine, I finished my beer, and we talked about music, about boats, about how crabs still climbed onto her porch. We didn't talk about the past anymore, but I knew this conversation had been a turning point. I had let Ashley go, not completely, not enough to forget her, but enough to move on. To be here with Margaret, with the sea, with myself. As we stood to go, she took my hand, her fingers light but warm. You're a good man, James, she said. Don't forget that. I smiled, and this time it was real. You too, Margaret, I said, and we walked down the pier, our steps in unison, like the notes of her melody, and I knew this was the end. Not the end, but the beginning of something new. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.